Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into some really fascinating material you sent in. It explores our inner world,
Yeah.
specifically this idea of having internal parts and a core self.
Yeah, this deep dive is really about unpacking a specific model, a way of understanding our, internal landscape. Our mission, I guess, is to explore these concepts, figure out the core ideas,
Hmm.
and see how this framework offers maybe a genuinely fresh perspective on inner conflict and, healing.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The source material jumps right in with this idea of internal parts and something it calls self. So maybe let's start right there.
Yeah.
What exactly is this self it talks about, and how does it connect to these internal parts?
Okay. So at the heart of it, the model says our internal system isn't just one thing, right? We have these distinct internal parts.
Uh-huh.
And then there's this concept of self. It's described as like an essential core within us. The source uses some pretty strong language, actually. It even calls it, for lack of a better word, a piece of God or big self.
A piece of God. Wow, that's quite a term. What's the significance there?
Well, the really crucial point the source makes is that this self, this core essence, isn't something only some people have. It's described as being present in everyone.
In everyone, okay.
And maybe even more surprisingly, it also says it's present within all of our parts, too.
Okay, hold on. That feels a bit counterintuitive.
Mhm.
If self is in me and it's also in my parts,
Ah.
how does inner conflict even happen?
Right, that's the key question. That's exactly where this idea of burdens comes in. The source equates these burdens, metaphorically, to something like sin in a Christian context.
Okay.
Basically, burdens are defined as anything that creates disconnection. They sort of weigh down the parts, they disconnect them from the self, and that gives them extreme impulses or extreme beliefs, extreme roles.
Oh, okay.
So when parts are burdened, they either kind of lose that connection to self or they just stop listening to it.
Yeah.
That's where the internal conflict, the tug of war, comes from.
So the part itself isn't the problem. It's the burden that's kind of distorting it, disconnecting it from its true nature and from self, forcing it into an extreme role.
Precisely, yeah. And that leads directly to the main goal of this whole approach,
Mm-hmm.
unburdening and reconnection.
Right.
The source claims that when parts are unburdened, they transform almost immediately. They let go of those extreme qualities and they gain a much deeper connection to the self. And crucially, they start to trust the self more.
So the internal healing journey is really about fostering this reconnection between
Yeah.
your core self and all these different parts of you.
That's a really key outcome, yeah. And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is the parallel the source draws between
Yeah.
this inner world and the outer world.
How so?
Well, think about it. Just like people in the outer world often feel disconnected, right, from each other or from, whatever they see as a higher power or big self
Mm.
because of the burdens they carry.
Yeah.
Our internal parts experience that same kind of isolation. They feel cut off from each other and from our core self. So unburdening isn't just about feeling better symptom-wise. It's presented as fostering connection, not only between your parts inside,
Right.
but also potentially between your whole self and that big self or whatever name works for you.
It's like healing inside helps connect the dots. Not just within you, but maybe outwards, upwards too.
That's definitely the implication the source leans into. It suggests this inner work isn't just, self-improvement. It's about connecting those dots, fostering a deeper link between your personal self and what it calls the big self, and written your whole internal system, all your parts, into more coherence, more connection.
Okay, so we've got self, parts, burdens causing disconnection. But then the source takes a turn that, well, you described it earlier as potentially mind-blowing.
Yeah, it does. It introduces this really surprising discovery that parts, they aren't always just single units. Apparently, parts can have their own parts.
Wait, parts have parts?
Uh-huh. And those subparts, they can also contain their own self.
Parts having parts, and those subparts have self too.
Oh.
Okay, yeah. My mind is officially a little bit blown right now. If yours is too, listening, that's totally understandable.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those concepts that makes you pause. The source actually describes having that initial whir mind-blowing reaction,
Right,
but then finding it starts to make a kind of aesthetic or spiritual sense.
right.
It's seen as these parallel or isomorphic systems, meaning systems with the same basic form repeating at every level. The analogies used are Russian stacking dolls
Oh, okay.
and fractals, those patterns that repeat within themselves.
Right, like a pattern inside a pattern, no matter how closely you look.
Exactly. The source notes it doesn't actually know how far down this goes, but they've seen subparts that also have their own subparts.
Mm.
So while it might feel really complex, maybe even a bit disconcerting at first, There's something the Source finds quite beautiful about this nested, self-similar thing happening inside us. It speaks to this incredible depth.
It really does. And it kind of reinforces this really radical idea that our parts are fundamentally sacred. Is that the right word?
Yes, that's a core emphasis. The Source sees parts not as problems to be fixed or managed, but as sacred beings.
Wow.
Because they contain their own piece of self, they are inherently worthy of the love and compassion from your core self. The parallel drawn is to the Christian idea that people are created in God's image, right, and are worthy of God's love. So the thinking is, if individuals can unburden, reconnect, transform, why wouldn't the same be true for our internal parts?
That completely shifts the perspective, doesn't it? It moves away from battling or controlling parts towards recognizing their intrinsic value, their potential. It sounds like this model naturally bridges psychological exploration with maybe spiritual or religious ideas.
It absolutely does, yeah. And the Source really digs into this connection. There's this anecdote about leading trainings for evangelical Christians. I think it was at Reformed Theological Seminary. And initially there was this debate rooted in, are people fundamentally good or bad? The breakthrough came when they reframed original sin as burdens.
As burdens.
Yeah, as these things that disconnect us from our true nature, from self. And that allowed for a common language.
Reframing original sin as burdens, that feels like a pretty significant shift. Powerful.
It really created a bridge, apparently. Their professor, Bill Richardson, summed it up really well. He said, "You're asking us to do inside ourselves what Jesus did in the outside world."
Okay, now that is really interesting.
Right. The external work of Jesus, as the Source describes it, involved going with compassion, curiosity, care to the exiles, right? The lepers, the poor, the outcasts, and healing them. This model suggests applying that exact same approach, but internally, to your own exiled or burdened parts.
So instead of trying to push away or silence the parts we don't like or the ones we fear, we actually turn toward them with curiosity, with care, like you would someone who's been cast out in the world. And then the Source ties this back to that bigger idea of divine reconnection.
Yes, exactly. It kind of posits this question: what if each of us and each of our parts actually contains a piece of that larger self that fundamentally longs to reconnect? So from this viewpoint, helping our parts unburden, helping them trust our core self, which then allows us to connect better with others, with the planet, with that big self, maybe that's serving this larger project of divine reconnection.
Wow. So inner healing isn't just personal work anymore. It's framed as potentially part of some cosmic reunion.
That's the profound spiritual angle the Source suggests this model offers, yeah. It proposes that a deep sense of awakening or enlightenment is actually more authentic, more sustainable if all of us, meaning all of our parts, are included in that journey.
Instead of seeing the ego or certain parts as bad, things to get rid of.
Exactly. Rather than leaving parts behind, in this view, the parts themselves yearn for connection to ourself just as much as we might yearn to connect to that larger self.
And this essential self, this core, the Source says that's fundamentally who we really are.
That's a common realization people seem to arrive at when they start this kind of inner exploration, what's often called awakening or enlightenment. It's presented here as the embodied realization of that inherent truth, really feeling it.
And this understanding.
Yeah.
It goes beyond any specific religion.
Absolutely. The Source is really clear about that. It doesn't require you to follow any particular spiritual belief system. It just asks us to consider that this beautiful essence is within you and within everyone else. And accessing it, it's often described simply as opening space inside.
Opening space inside. How is that different from, say, some meditation practices that focus on emptying the mind?
Well, the Source contrasts it with practices that might involve trying to force thoughts or parts away, which can feel like wrestling with them. In this approach, instead of fighting, you're described as lovingly asking parts if they'd be willing to just open a little space, just for a few moments. And when they do, the self is said to emerge immediately and spontaneously.
That sounds almost surprisingly simple for something that could be so profound.
Yeah, and the Source is quick to say, look, this can sound like a lot of talk until you actually experience it.
Right. Makes sense.
Because of that, it offers some practical ways to start exploring this inner landscape, to get to know your parts better, and bring more of your core self, that curious, compassionate presence to them.
Okay, let's look at one of those. The first exercise mentioned is for navigating dilemmas, right?
Right. It's a way to approach those situations in life where you feel really pulled in different directions, that inner conflict.
Hmm.
You bring a specific dilemma to mind, and you start by just noticing the different internal parts that seem to be on opposing sides of the issue. And also, this is important, notice how your core sense of self, feels toward that internal battle or toward each of those parts.
So step one is just observing the internal players in the conflict and your reaction to it all. Then what?
Well, the core idea is to get to know each part involved, but one at a time, and from that self-energy. So you might ask part one that's really strongly involved to just step back for a bit. Maybe imagine it going into a waiting room or sitting in a chair across the room, just to create some space inside.
Not banishing it, just creating space.
Exactly. It's just setting a boundary for the exercise. Then you focus on the part that's still there, and you notice, again, how do you feel toward that part? If you notice judgment or annoyance or fear, those feelings are actually other parts.
Ah,
And you'd ask them to just relax a little, step back slightly, so you can get to a place of genuine curiosity about the part you're focusing on.
so it's really about clearing the way to approach the part from that place of self with curiosity, compassion.
Exactly. If you can get to that place of curiosity, then you communicate with the part that's present. You can ask it things like, what does it want you to know about its position on this dilemma? Why is it taking such a strong stance? And, crucially, what does it fear would happen if the other side of the dilemma were to win?
Hmm.
And the key here is just to listen. Listen with an open heart, open mind. You don't need to agree or disagree. Just let the part know you're hearing it, that you respect its view, you're trying to understand. And just notice how it reacts to being heard, being seen by you like that.
Giving voice and validation to each side of that internal argument.
Yes. And after you feel like you've really heard that part, you can switch. Ask the first part you spoke with to go to the waiting room again, and invite the other part, the one on the other side of the dilemma, to step forward. And you get to know that part in the same way.
Same process.
Same process. Seek curiosity. Ask what it wants you to know, why it's so strong, what it fears.
So you're intentionally giving equal airtime, equal curiosity to both sides of the internal debate.
Precisely. Then, after you've heard them both individually, if the parts seem willing, you can bring them into the same room internally. And you act as a mediator.
Correct.
You facilitate a conversation between them about the dilemma, help them hear each other respectfully, sometimes just reminding them gently that they're both parts of you, that they have that connection that can shift things. Just observe what happens as they maybe get to know each other from a slightly different angle.
It really does sound like setting up a kind of peace negotiation inside yourself.
It's a mediated conversation, yeah. And at some point in that chat, you can pause and step more fully into a leadership role from that self place.
Right.
And you can ask the parts, would they be willing in the future to shift, to move from being these decision makers battling each other to becoming more like advisors, giving you their input, their wisdom, but ultimately trusting you to make the final decision about the dilemma.
Trusting you as the leader of the whole internal system. How does the source suggest you convey that leadership?
Well, part of it is just embodying those qualities of self, curiosity, calm, confidence, compassion. The source also suggests it can be helpful to gently remind the parts of who you are now, your age, your current identity, basically letting them know they don't have to carry the weight of making these big adult decisions alone anymore. You're here, you're capable of leading, and then you just see how they react to that idea, that possibility of shifting into an advisory role.
And what's typically learned? What comes out of going through this kind of exercise, assuming the parts cooperate?
Well, if your parts were able to cooperate like that, you often find that they really didn't know each other very well at all. They've been stuck in these polarized roles, right? Operating from these extreme perspectives, these extreme visions of the other part. And the source points out how much this mirrors conflicts we see outside ourselves. International conflicts, political ones, even family fights, where there's often a lack of good leadership, a failure to really understand the other side's perspective, their fears. Often in our inner world, we've just been busy with life, right? And these inner conflicts have been left to parts that feel young or burdened, and they lack that guidance.
It's like parts have been stuck fighting it out in the basement because nobody was upstairs really leading the house.
Kind of like that, yeah. And the source acknowledges, look, one attempt at this exercise might not immediately stop the battle, especially if the stakes feel really high for the parts involved.
Sure.
But even just engaging in this process, It starts to build connection. It builds trust. It builds that sense of you offering new leadership inside. It's the same principle you see in things like couples therapy, right? Listen deeply to one person, then deeply to the other. Help them feel seen, heard, then bring them together to communicate respectfully.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But the source is also realistic, right? It includes a check-in about common challenges. These exercises might not always go smoothly.
Absolutely. Yeah, the source is very clear on this. Whether these exercises go smoothly or if maybe you can only do pieces of them, it depends a lot on how ready your parts are, how much trust they already have in you as the leader and in each other.
Hmm.
So if parts aren't stepping back or if it feels really difficult, it's explicitly stated this does not mean you're failing.
That's important.
It simply means more time is needed, more time to build trust, help them feel safe enough to open space to show themselves to you.
So the key is patience,
Yeah,
persistence,
yeah.
not self-criticism.
Exactly. It's about reframing the difficulty. It's just information about the system's readiness, not some kind of personal failure. Now, if you have been able to do the exercises, it suggests your parts already have a certain degree of trust. But the source notes, yeah, this isn't true for everyone, especially people with histories of trauma or really difficult experiences. It just might take more time, more gentle persistence.
And what about those kind of strange experiences? Things people report sometimes during inner exploration, like suddenly feeling sleepy or getting distracted or even developing a headache.
Yeah, those are mentioned as common and actually really important signals. The source explains these are often protectors.
Protectors.
Parts whose job it is to keep you safe. They might be distracting you or even sort of pulling you out of the inner process because they perceive some kind of threat or they feel the system just isn't ready to go deeper right now.
Like an internal security system yelling, danger, abort mission.
Yeah, something like that. And the crucial advice here is don't fight them. Don't try to push through them.
Okay.
Instead, the instruction is to turn your curiosity towards these resisting parts. Find out what they're afraid of. Acknowledge their fears, honor them, even if they seem illogical to you. Don't battle these protectors. The path forward is to understand them, befriend them.
Which leads us perfectly into the second exercise the source discusses, befriending a challenging protector.
Right. This one is specifically for working with a part that feels difficult or maybe bothersome to you, like an inner critic, perhaps, or a part that drives perfectionism, or one that triggers a lot of shame. You start by focusing on this part, noticing where you feel it in or around your body, and acknowledging how you feel toward it,
Yeah.
which is likely going to be strained or negative.
Because it's causing trouble. Yeah.
Exactly. So to make the process feel safer for other parts, parts that might have big issues with this challenging protector, the source suggests placing this protector part in your imagination inside a contained room. Maybe it has a window.
Okay.
This boundary can help other parts relax a bit, feel safe enough to maybe drop their weapons or defenses, and that allows you to access curiosity about the part in the room. You might ask those other parts to just step back slightly.
It really sounds like managing the whole internal system, trying to create the right conditions to connect with just one part.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the source adds, look, if those other parts aren't willing to separate, that's okay too. You can spend the time getting to know their fears or issues with the protector first.
Gotcha.
But if you can get to that state of curiosity toward the part in the contained room, you communicate with it. Maybe looking through the imaginary window.
And what's key to ask this challenging part?
You ask what it wants you to know about why it exists or why it does what it does. And crucially, what is it most afraid would happen if it were to step out of its protective role?
Yeah.
If it's able to communicate, the source suggests expressing genuine appreciation for the fact that it has, in its own way, been trying to protect you.
Appreciation. For a part that might be causing pain or shame, that feels incredibly counterintuitive, radical even.
It does, doesn't it? But it's absolutely central to this model. It's about seeing beyond the behavior you don't like to the protective intention underneath.
Right.
You might also ask the part how old it thinks you are and gently update it to your actual current age. See how it reacts to that. And then comes maybe the most transformative question.
Okay.
If it were totally liberated from this difficult protective role, maybe because whatever it's protecting was healed or just doesn't need that kind of protection anymore, what else would it like to do? What's its preferred way of being?
What would this part actually choose to do if it wasn't burdened by this exhausting, often painful job?
Exactly. And after it answers that, you can ask what it needs from you in the future to help it feel safer, maybe, or to consider a different role. And after this whole conversation, you can check back in with your other parts. See how they reacted to witnessing you approach this challenging protector with curiosity and compassion instead of judgment.
What's the deeper goal here? The insight behind this specific exercise with the protector.
Yeah. Well, the source frames it as going to your inner enemies, those parts that cause you the most trouble, or the ones you dislike the most, and having compassion for them. There's a mention of presenting this idea to the Dalai Lama, actually, which prompted the question, what would it be like if we could extend compassion not just to outer enemies, but to our inner ones, too?
So applying that principle of compassion universally,
Mm-hmm.
inward as well as outward.
Yes. And the source notes that if you stay with this process, if you ask these non-threatening questions from a place of real, genuine curiosity, these inner enemies will start to reveal their secret stories.
Good stories.
Yeah, you start to learn how they were forced into these difficult roles, what they were originally trying to protect. And often you discover they were actually heroes.
Heroes, the inner critic, the anxious warrior,
Yeah.
the part that pushes you relentlessly. They could be heroes.
In this framework, yes, they took on incredibly difficult, often painful jobs to try and keep some vulnerable part of you safe, often at great cost to themselves. The source quotes Longfellow here. It's powerful. If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility.
Wow. That's an incredibly powerful quote.
And the source applies it inwardly. Listening to the secret histories of these inner enemies, these protectors, it's said to inevitably dissolve all the hostility that other parts feel towards them. The key takeaway is that they are seen as all good parts forced into roles they don't like.
What?
They're often eager to leave these painful jobs, but they just don't feel it's safe enough yet. And a big part of why they don't feel safe is because they don't trust you, as the leader, to handle whatever it is they're protecting. Approaching them with this curiosity and compassion, that's how you build that essential trust.
So their resistance isn't necessarily defiance. It's more like a signal that they don't yet trust your capacity to lead the system, to handle the underlying vulnerability safely.
Exactly. It's just information about the state of the internal relationship, not a judgment on the part itself.
And the source points out, doing this kind of inner work,
Mm-hmm.
it can have significant broader impacts, not just internally.
Yes. The material definitely suggests that as you engage in this process, you can expect things to start shifting, not only in your inner life, but also potentially in your outer life, too, adopting this fundamentally different way of understanding yourself. It changes how you see things, how you interact with the world. It's noted, though, that while changes in you can be incredibly positive, they might be welcomed by some people in your life, but maybe not necessarily by everyone.
Change, even positive change, can definitely be disruptive to existing relationships sometimes.
That's often the case, yeah.
So, okay. What does this all mean then? We've taken quite a deep dive into this really fascinating model. Internal parts, a core self, exploring this idea that disconnection isn't just an outer thing, but a powerful force inside us, and that there's this profound potential for reconnection.
Yeah, we've seen how burdens can kind of weigh down our internal parts, right? Leading them into these extreme roles, disconnecting them from our core self and from each other, and how that mirrors the disconnections we see out in the world, but also the power of unburdening, how it's presented as allowing for genuine transformation, building trust, and letting us return to our essential nature.
Yeah.
And letting our parts return to their essential nature, too.
And we explored some really practical ways, though maybe challenging sometimes, to engage with this inner landscape, from navigating dilemmas by really trying to understand the fears and perspectives of those warring parts, to that radical idea of befriending challenging protectors, hearing their secret stories, understanding the protective, often heroic reasons behind their difficult roles.
Right. And this isn't just about, symptom reduction or feeling better in the moment. The journey is framed as potentially serving something larger, maybe even a profound kind of divine reconnection. And it's accessible to anyone, regardless of specific beliefs, just by cultivating that state of curiosity and compassion and opening space inside.
It really does make you rethink conflict, doesn't it? On every level, the battles inside us, the battles we see out in the world. Which brings us to an important question for you, listening right now. The source quotes Longfellow. If we could read the secret history of our enemies, it would disarm all hostility. If applying curiosity and compassion, hearing the hidden stories of our inner enemies, our protectors, If they can bring about such profound shifts and dissolve internal hostility, what might happen in the outer world if we truly made a dedicated effort to understand the secret histories, the fears, the burdens, the perceived protective needs of those we currently see as opponents?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope this exploration gives you something valuable to reflect on and maybe even explore within yourself.